Turn the music down or we'll shut this whole thing down ourselves. That's what one of the off-duty cops barked, hand resting heavy on his belt. His buddies stood behind him, smoking like they owned the block. Marcus tried to stay calm, palms up, voice steady. Come on, man. It's Elijah's birthday. We've got kids here. This is family. But the cop leaned in close, eyes cold. Family. I see a bunch of noise violations and warrants waiting to happen. That's when it happened. One of the cops shoved Elijah, sending him crashing to the ground. In an instant, the officer pulled his gun and fired. The shot rang out, tearing through the warm evening air. Marcus felt time freeze. His son lying there, blood spreading across the lawn where they had just played. The joy was gone, replaced by rage, a kind of rage that was sharp and heavy, like a fist around his chest. And the officers, they walked away, like nothing happened. No remorse, no regret, just like it was another day for them. But for Marcus, everything changed. His son was dead. And as the cops turned their backs, Marcus made a promise. They'd never get away with this. Not today, not ever. The summer air was thick with the scent of barbecue, a hint of charred meat mixing with the sweetness of ripe peaches and fresh-cut grass. It was a perfect day for a family gathering. Marcus stood by the grill, flipping the burgers and chicken, his brow damp with sweat as he made sure the heat was just right. His little boy Elijah was running around the yard, his laughter echoing off the brick walls of the house. He was only 7, but it seemed like the whole neighborhood had come out to celebrate. Elijah's energy was contagious, his small body darting back and forth between the adults, showing off his new toy car to the kids, his grin wide and proud. Marcus couldn't help but smile every time he caught a glimpse of his son. The bond they shared was unspoken but strong. Elijah was his pride and joy, the reason he worked late hours, the reason he kept his nose clean, the reason he woke up every morning with purpose. He watched Elijah stop at the edge of the lawn, his eyes lighting up as his cousins came running toward him. The children gathered around, each one excited to see what Elijah had, the birthday boy at the center of it all. They ran around, chasing each other, the shrieks of their laughter mixing with the sounds of sizzling meat from the grill. It was a simple celebration, a birthday party with close family and a few friends, but in that moment it felt like everything was right in the world. Marcus's wife, Tanya, walked over to him, holding a plate of food in her hands. She handed it to him with a smile, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face flushed from the summer heat. "How's it looking?" she asked, her voice light, full of love. "It's perfect," Marcus said, nodding toward Elijah, who was now showing off his new sneakers to a couple of his cousins. "He's growing up so fast, Tanya. Makes you wonder where the time's gone." Tanya followed his gaze, watching their son with a proud smile. "He's a good kid," she said softly. "Look at him. He's got your energy, your drive, I swear. He's got the world ahead of him." Marcus's heart swelled. The warmth from the grill and the glow of the summer sun couldn't compare to the warmth he felt in his chest when he looked at Elijah. Everything Marcus had worked for, everything he had done, was for this moment, for this family. There was nothing in the world that could break this peace, this joy. Not while his son was safe, surrounded by family, happy, healthy, and full of life. The neighborhood felt alive, every corner bustling with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting over fences. The backyard was vibrant with color streamers hanging from the fence, balloons bobbing in the soft breeze, and tables stacked high with food. The whole street seemed to come alive with the celebration, the houses lined up with their wide porches and neatly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Kids rode their bikes up and down the street, their laughter ringing out as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. Marcus couldn't remember the last time he had felt this kind of peace. It was the kind of day where everything just made sense. His world had always been tough, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. But today, for once, there was nothing but light. No worries, no fears, just family, just love. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Marcus found himself stealing glances at Elijah, his little boy running around with the other kids, blissfully unaware of anything other than the fun he was having. His heart was full. There was no doubt in his mind this was the life he had always wanted, and in this moment, he had everything. But deep down, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't that the day felt wrong, far from it, but there was a lingering sense, a twinge of unease that pulled at him as he watched his son. Maybe it was the way the shadows lengthened across the grass, or the way the neighborhood seemed to have become quieter as the evening wore on. Marcus didn't know why, but the feeling gnawed at him, pulling at his thoughts. He shook it off. Tonight wasn't about worry. Tonight was about celebrating his son, about being present, about creating memories, and for once, Marcus let himself believe that nothing could disrupt this moment. He was wrong. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows over the backyard as Marcus poured the last round of drinks, passing them to his guests. His laughter filled the air, the kind of light-hearted, carefree sound that came with spending a perfect afternoon with family and friends. Tanya had already started gathering the plates, and Elijah was still running circles around his cousins, showing them his new toy truck. It felt like the world had paused in a moment of peace, a moment that Marcus thought would last forever. But then, the quiet was broken. The unmistakable hum of a police siren cut through the warm evening air, drawing Marcus's attention. His first thought was that it might have been an emergency down the block, but then the siren stopped, the low rumble of the squad car's engine growing louder. His gaze shifted to the end of the street, and there, parked at the curb, was a patrol car. 2 officers stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement with that familiar authority. Noise complaint, one officer said curtly, a young man with a squared jaw and an air of impatience. Officer Grant was his name, and his eyes scanned the crowd before settling on Marcus. His lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We've been called out here for excessive noise. You know the rules. You're breaking curfew." Marcus frowned, the pleasant atmosphere beginning to shift. He wiped his hands on his apron, standing tall but keeping his voice level. "Officer, this is a family gathering. It's a birthday party for my son. There are kids here, playing, not causing trouble." Officer Grant didn't budge. His eyes narrowed, taking in the balloons still swaying in the breeze, the kids running around, with laughter in the air, the music playing softly in the background. His gaze flicked to the speaker, then back to Marcus, and it was like he had already made up his mind. "Doesn't matter," Officer Grant muttered, as if it were an afterthought. "Noise is noise, and you're in violation of curfew. Doesn't matter if it's a kid's birthday or not. Keep it down, or we'll be forced to take further action." The air seemed to thicken. Tanya, who had been standing off to the side, exchanged a quick look with Marcus. His jaw clenched. He could feel his heart rate quicken, and in that instant, the easygoing mood of the gathering started to shift. People were watching now, the conversation slowly dying down as the tension mounted. Marcus kept his voice steady, trying to remain composed. "Officer, I understand, but we're not disturbing anyone. Look around." He gestured at the neighbors, who were chatting among themselves, all of them familiar faces. "This is a peaceful gathering. We're just celebrating. No harm, no noise, complaints from anyone else." Officer Grant didn't respond at first, his gaze darting to the other officer who had been standing silently behind him, arms crossed. Officer Daniels finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tell that to the people who called it in," he said. His tone was mocking, almost as if he found the situation amusing. "We're just doing our job. You might want to keep the noise down, unless you're asking for trouble." He looked Marcus up and down, his eyes full of judgment. "You know how it is in this neighborhood." A low tension started to spread through the crowd. People were looking away now, avoiding eye contact, as if they could feel the heat rising between Marcus and the officers. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced around at his family, at Elijah running happily on the grass, his cousins gathered around him, everyone blissfully unaware of the impending storm. He tried to keep it together. This wasn't about escalation. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. It was supposed to be about family, about celebrating life, not fighting over trivial things. But as the officers stood there, making their demands, it was clear they didn't care about the celebration. They didn't care about the children laughing, the families gathered, the warmth of the moment. The longer the officers lingered, the more the situation seemed to deteriorate. Daniel stepped forward, his tone growing even more dismissive. "You've been warned. This is your last chance," he snapped. That's when Elijah, running nearby with his toy truck in hand, slipped and bumped into the table where the bottles of soda and beer were stacked. It wasn't hard, but the small bottle of soda toppled off the table, hitting the ground with a loud crack, its contents spilling out. It was nothing more than an accident, a child's clumsy move, but in the charged air, the sound was deafening. It felt like the breaking of a dam, a trigger that would set everything off. One of the officers, Officer Grant, snapped his head toward the sound. He cursed under his breath, and in an instant, he was at Elijah's side, his hand roughly grabbing the boy's arm to pull him up. Elijah stumbled, looking up at the officer with wide eyes. He was scared, confused, and Marcus could see the look on his son's face, the one that said he didn't understand. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Marcus's voice rose without thinking. his instinct to protect his son kicking in. He stepped forward, his body coming between the officer and Elijah. "Don't touch my son." Grant didn't respond. Without warning, he shoved Marcus aside, knocking him off balance, a move so sudden and forceful that Marcus stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground. Tanya screamed from behind him, but Marcus barely heard it. All he could see was Elijah, his son, looking up at the officer in terror. Officer Daniels took a step forward then, his eyes full of malice. "You think you can talk back to us?" he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not in charge here. We run things." Marcus's blood boiled. The fury rose like a tidal wave, but he fought to keep it under control. "This is a birthday party. For my son, you have no right." But his words were drowned out by the sound of Officer Grant's gun being drawn. The flash of metal caught the sun's dying rays. The weapon raised swiftly, pointing directly at Elijah, who was still trying to stand. The sudden movement sent Marcus's heart racing. His instincts screamed for him to act, to protect his son at any cost. But he was too late. The gunshot rang out. The deafening sound tore through the night, shattering the peace in an instant. Marcus's eyes went wide, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. The world seemed to slow. Elijah's small body jerked backward, his face twisting in shock, then crumpling to the ground. Marcus rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he knelt beside his son. Blood soaked into the grass beneath Elijah's lifeless form. That once joyful celebration had turned into chaos, a nightmare unfolding right in front of him. His hands trembled as he tried to shake Elijah awake, to scream for help, to make it stop. But there was nothing. Tanya was crying, her screams echoing through the yard, as the neighbors began to panic. The officers, meanwhile, seemed unmoved, cold expressions on their faces as they watched Marcus in stunned silence. The world had stopped, and in the silence that followed, all Marcus could hear was the echo of that single, violent shot. The gunshot echoed in the stillness of the evening, its reverberations hanging in the air like the ringing of a bell, too loud, too final. Time seemed to stretch out, the world slowing to a crawl as Marcus stared in disbelief at his son's crumpled form on the grass. The vibrant life that had been Elijah just moments ago was now extinguished, a tiny, helpless body lying still, blood staining the bright green lawn. The once joyful celebration had turned into a nightmare, a moment of terror frozen in time. The first scream came from Tanya, sharp and high-pitched, ripping through the quiet that had followed the gunfire. It was a sound that no parent ever should hear, a cry of pure agony, a cry that shook the very foundation of Marcus's world. Tanya dropped to her knees beside Elijah, her hands reaching out to him, her face a mask of horror. Her body trembled with disbelief, her lips moving but no words coming out. Her hands shook as she tried to check for a pulse, her eyes wide with panic, but the blood soaking through Elijah's clothes told the story too clearly. He was gone. Marcus could hardly move, his body rooted to the spot as the reality of what had just happened washed over him like a cold wave. His mind was a blur, unable to comprehend that his son, the boy who had been so full of life, so full of joy, was now lying lifeless on the grass. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight as if the very air had been sucked from his lungs. He wanted to scream, to shout, to do something, anything, but his body refused to obey. His hand hovered over Elijah's still form, trembling, as if he couldn't bring himself to touch what had once been his son. The chaos around him was impossible to ignore. People were shouting now, running, some reaching for their phones, others stepping back in fear. The officers, Officer Grant and Officer Daniels, had already turned and fled, disappearing into their patrol car, leaving the scene in a rush. They didn't even look back, didn't hesitate. It was like they knew exactly what they had done, and their job was done, as if they were never there in the first place. Marcus's vision blurred as he looked up, his eyes catching on the figures of the officers retreating. The burning anger that had started to smolder within him, deep in the pit of his stomach, fled into something much worse. He could hear his own breath coming in short, shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest, but he didn't move. His body was frozen, rooted to the ground. The men who had done this to his son were walking away, disappearing into the distance, leaving him with nothing but the lifeless body of his child. It was as if they didn't care. It was as if Elijah's life had meant nothing to them. And that realization struck Marcus like a punch to the gut. Tanya's sobs broke through the haze of his thoughts. She was still kneeling beside Elijah, clutching his body to her chest, her tears falling freely, her voice broken with grief. "No, no, no," she whispered, over and over again, as if she couldn't accept what had just happened. Her anguish was palpable, the sound of her pain tearing through Marcus's very soul. The neighborhood, once vibrant and alive with the laughter of children, had fallen silent. The once joyous voices of family and friends had been replaced by stunned whispers and fearful glances. Neighbors were still standing in their yards, frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to say. The air was thick with tension, the light of the day fading into a cold, oppressive silence. Marcus could see people standing there, some with their hands on their faces, others whispering to each other, but no one stepped forward. No one came to help. It was as if the whole world had turned its back on them. Marcus took a step forward, his mind finally clearing enough for him to act. He dropped to his knees beside Tanya, pulling her away from Elijah's body, his hands trembling as they touched her shoulders. She resisted at first, her body shaking with grief, but then she collapsed into his arms, the weight of her pain too much to bear. Her sobs racked her body as Marcus held her tightly, trying to offer some semblance of comfort, though he felt as broken as she did. The sounds around them were muffled. It was as if everything had been submerged underwater. Marcus's heart was still racing, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but his body had gone numb. He couldn't stop staring at Elijah, his son's face frozen in a peaceful, innocent expression, as if he had been asleep. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. The boy who had been running, laughing, sharing his joy with everyone, was now gone, his life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Marcus's mind started to race. He couldn't think, he couldn't process what had happened. It was all too much, too sudden, too violent. The world had just been yanked out from under him, and now he was left with nothing but his own anger and frustration. Frustration that he couldn't protect Elijah. Frustration that those responsible had just walked away, without a second thought. His vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't because of shock. It was the tears that filled his eyes. His breath came in ragged bursts as his chest tightened. Painfully he couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. All he could feel was the pain, the unbearable weight of the loss, the overwhelming grief that threatened to swallow him whole. "I'll get them," Marcus muttered under his breath, though he didn't even know who he was speaking to. The words came out like a promise, a vow, a desperate need to do something, anything. His eyes burned with anger, with hatred, as he looked back at the officers' retreating figures. They would pay for this. They had to. Tanya lifted her head from his chest, her tear-streaked face pale. Her voice was hoarse as she whispered, "Marcus, don't do anything reckless." But Marcus didn't hear her. He was already on his feet, his fists clenched, his mind racing. The words from the officers echoed in his mind, "We're just doing our job." They hadn't cared, they hadn't even hesitated. And that thought, that cold, detached indifference, was eating away at him from the inside. "I'm going to make them pay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, the promise falling from his lips like a curse. But Tanya, seeing the look in his eyes, reached for him, grabbing his arm with a grip that was both desperate and pleading. "Please, Marcus, don't go down that path," she begged, her voice trembling. "We'll find a way, but not this way." But Marcus was already slipping out of her grasp, his mind made up. There was no turning back now, not after what they had done. The day of Elijah's funeral felt like the world had been drained of color. The once vibrant flowers in the backyard had faded to muted hues, the sky above an overcast blanket of gray, reflecting the heaviness in Marcus's chest. The air was thick with the weight of grief, and every step he took felt like a burden. The funeral home was filled with soft murmurs, the sound of hushed voices trying to offer comfort that felt hollow and empty. The place, like Marcus's heart, was full of sadness, but devoid of any real hope. Tanya sat at the front of the room, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The pain in her eyes was unbearable to witness, a pain so deep and raw that it seemed to consume her every moment. She had lost her child, their child, and the woman who had once been vibrant and full of life now seemed like a shell of herself. It was as if Elijah's death had hollowed her out, leaving her a ghost, present only in form, but not in spirit. Marcus stood near the back, leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed on the casket at the front of the room. It was closed, and though it seemed like the most natural thing in the world, it was the one thing that felt wrong to Marcus. He had never seen his son lying still, not once in his 7 short years. The thought that Elijah was now gone, locked forever in that small, dark box, sent a ripple of ice through his veins. The room around him blurred as his vision filled with tears, but he refused to let them fall. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elijah's face, saw him running across the yard, that bright, beautiful smile lighting up his face. But now, all he could see was blood. The priest spoke, softly, words meant to comfort, to heal, but they felt useless. They meant nothing. Nothing could bring Elijah back. Nothing could fill the gaping hole that had been left behind. Marcus clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands as his anger began to rise once more. Justice, real justice, was something the system would never provide. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a quiet sob behind him. Marcus turned to see his old friend Rico standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. They made eye contact, and Marcus nodded slightly. Rico's face was hard, his expression serious, the weight of their shared history evident in the lines of his face. Rico had been part of Marcus's life before, back when the streets were the only family he knew, back when violence had been a way of life. They had once run together, making moves that couldn't be undone, but Marcus had walked away from that life, seeking something better, something clean. That was before he had a family, before he had Elijah. But now, with Elijah gone, Marcus knew there was only one way forward. Rico walked over to him, his voice low. "You know what's going down, right?" he said, his eyes scanning the room, making sure no one else could hear. "The cops. They're gonna get away with it. That's how it works. The badge covers them." Marcus's jaw tightened, and he didn't need to answer. The words had already sunk deep into him. He had known this truth for as long as he could. Remember, the system wasn't built for people like them. The laws weren't written to protect the vulnerable, not really. They were written to protect the powerful, the ones who had the means to shield themselves. And the cops who killed Elijah, they were as untouchable as anyone could be. Rico leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know people, Marcus, people who can help with this, people who have been in the game long enough to know how to make things disappear." He paused, his eyes sharp. "You want revenge? You know how to get it." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, his fists still clenched. He had thought about this, over and over. He had heard the stories, heard of people who had taken justice into their own hands, who had made the law work for them, but he hadn't believed it could be his path. He had walked away from that life, from that world. But now everything had changed. His eyes met Rico's, and in that moment, Marcus knew. He knew there was no going back. He had crossed a line the moment the officers pulled that trigger. There was nothing left to lose, no one left to protect, except the memory of his son. And he would make them feel the same loss. "I need names," Marcus said, his voice low, flat, like it had been drained of any emotion. "I want the ones who are untouchable. I want them to pay, not just the cops, their families too." Rico's eyebrows rose slightly, but there was no judgment in his eyes. "You want the whole package," he said, as if the thought of taking it all was something routine. "All right, I'll get you what you need, but you know this won't stop here. You're in it now. There's no turning back." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I don't care." And just like that, the decision was made. Later that night, Marcus sat at a dimly lit table in an old rundown warehouse on the edge of town. The air smelled of oil and stale smoke, the remnants of an underworld Marcus had left behind. Around him sat men he hadn't seen in years, old friends, old enemies. They were the kind of men who operated in shadows, who knew the laws didn't apply to them. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and respect, recognizing the man who had once been a part of their world. Marcus's eyes met theirs, his jaw set, his mind focused on one thing and one thing only, making those who had killed Elijah feel the pain he now carried. "I want the names of their families," Marcus said, his voice cold and determined. "I'm going after every one of them, every last person who's tied to those officers. We're sending a message." There was a pause, a few men exchanging glances. Then Rico spoke, his tone serious but approving. "You really want to do this, Marcus? You know the score. These people, they'll come for you. No questions asked." "I don't care," Marcus repeated. "I won't stop until I've made them feel what I feel, until I've taken everything from them." And so the plan began. One by one, they mapped out the officers' lives. They tracked their movements, learnt their routines, found their families. Each name on the list was a target, each address a place where Marcus's vengeance would be delivered. They wouldn't stop until every last one of them paid the price for Elijah's life. As the days passed, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. The more he planned, the clearer the path became. He could feel the anger and hatred fueling his every step, but at the same time, something else lingered, the remnants of his humanity, the part of him that wondered if this was the right choice, if this was what Elijah would have wanted. But that part of him was fading. The need for justice had taken over. The need for revenge had consumed him. The nights had become a blur of planning and surveillance. Marcus could hardly sleep. his mind constantly racing, running through the details of his plan. The old world he had walked away from, the shadows, the underground connections, the world of violence and retribution had come rushing back. Each day he sank deeper into it, the line between justice and vengeance blurring more and more. He knew there was no turning back now. It was either this, or he would be consumed by the anger and pain of Elijah's death. Marcus sat in his car, the engine idling quietly, parked a few blocks away from Officer Grant's house. The street was quiet, the lights dim, but Marcus knew what to look for. He'd spent hours watching, learning the rhythm of the officer's life, the patterns that Grant and his family followed. Every move had to be calculated. The plan had to be flawless. There could be no mistakes. He'd spent days tracking down every lead, finding out where Officer Grant lived, where he went after work, what time he ate dinner with his family, when he picked up his kids from school. Each detail added to the plan. He knew everything about the officer now, his wife's name, his daughter's school, his son's favorite football team. Nothing was left to chance. The tension was growing inside Marcus, the desire for revenge pulsing like a beat in his veins. He was consumed, every waking moment filled with thoughts of what was coming, how to make those responsible for Elijah's death feel the same pain. His body was restless, a tight knot of anticipation in his chest. He barely spoke anymore, his words few and far between. His mind focused solely on the task at hand. His team was ready, waiting for his signal. Rico, the same man who had offered to help, stood by his side, helping coordinate the crew. The others were old associatesmen who had walked the same path Marcus had once walked. They knew the game. They knew how to get in and out without leaving a trace. They were the perfect team for the job, and Marcus trusted them. But even with the perfect plan and the perfect team, a part of him knew he was walking down a dangerous road. Each step forward brought him further into darkness, further from the man he had once been. But he couldn't stop now. The rage inside him wouldn't let him. The first hit was quick, calculated, like a machine moving through its gears. The target was Officer Grant's house, the officer who had pulled the trigger that had stolen Elijah's life. Marcus had been waiting for this moment, watching as Grant's car pulled into the driveway. His wife, Sarah, was sitting on the front porch reading a book. The kids were inside, probably watching TV or playing video games, blissfully unaware of the danger looming over them. Marcus gave the signal. Enrico's team moved into position, surrounding the house with practiced ease. They moved quickly and quietly, like shadows, making sure they wouldn't be seen. Marcus stayed back, his gaze fixed on the front door, his breath slow and steady. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, the culmination of everything he had been planning for weeks. It was time. They breached the house without warning, moving in with swift precision, using the same tactics Grant himself would have used in his own line of work. They didn't give the family a chance to react. The sound of the door being kicked in was loud and jarring, but Marcus was already inside, moving swiftly to the living room where Sarah Grant was sitting. She looked up, startled, her eyes widening in shock as she saw the masked men entering her home. "Stay down." One of Marcus's men barked as he moved forward, gun trained on Sarah. She froze, her mouth opening as if to scream, but the man's gesture silenced her. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Her expression was one of complete fear, but there was also confusion. She had no idea who these men were, why they were here, or what had just happened to her husband. "Where's your husband?" Marcus asked, his voice cold and controlled. His anger burned beneath the surface, but he kept it buried, focusing on the task at hand. "He's at work," Sarah stammered, her hands shaking as she dropped the book she had been holding. "Please, what is this? What do you want?" Marcus leaned in, his face inches from hers, his eyes hard. "This is about your husband," he said, each word coming out slow and deliberate. "This is about the fact that he took my son's life. And now, I'm taking everything he loves." The rest of the team had already moved through the house, ensuring that the children were contained, their movements swift and controlled. Sarah's son, a boy no older than Elijah, was being held in the hallway, his eyes wide with terror. His sister was in the living room, clutching her stuffed animal, trying to make sense of what was happening. Marcus could feel his own anger rising as he looked at the boy, as he saw the fear in the child's eyes, the same kind of fear Elijah must have felt when the officers had barged into their yard, when Grant had raised his gun and shot Elijah without a second thought. Marcus felt the weight of the decision he had made, felt the tug of morality versus revenge, but it was too late. The anger had already consumed him. There was no turning back. "Your father needs to understand what this feels like," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. And if I have to take you, his family, to make him understand, then so be it. He stepped back, allowing his crew to do what they had been trained to do: subdue the family, hold them hostage, send a message. It wasn't about the fear of losing these people, it was about sending a message to the officers, to the ones who thought they could get away with anything. The entire operation had taken less than 10 minutes. They were in and out with no trace left behind, their actions efficient, professional. But as they loaded the family into separate rooms, Marcus's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were on Grant, on the officer who had killed his son. It wasn't enough to hurt his family. No, this was just the beginning. He had to make them feel the same pain Elijah had felt as the team cleared out of the house. Marcus stood at the door, his eyes scanning the street. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, but he felt a strange emptiness as well. The anger hadn't been enough to fill the hole left by Elijah's death. He had tried to fill it with revenge, but he knew deep down that nothing would ever bring his son back. The first hit had gone smoothly, but Marcus knew it wouldn't be the last. There would be more targets, more families. The path of vengeance was long, and it was never satisfied. It was a path that would consume him, and yet he had no choice but to walk it. The quiet of the night was suffocating, wrapping itself around Marcus like a thick, heavy blanket. The mission had been successful, but the satisfaction of it all was fleeting. He had taken out several of the officers' families, Officer Grant's wife and children, the ones who had been the most vulnerable. Every move had been meticulously planned, each family member a pawn in a game he hadn't chosen to play, but one he was fully immersed in now. But even as his crew wrapped up the final pieces of the plan, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He hadn't gotten what he truly wanted yet. Not the families, not the message. What he needed now was the man who had pulled the trigger that day. The man who had killed Elijah without a second thought. Officer Daniels. He had been hiding for days, scared, running from the consequences of his actions. Marcus knew that. He had the information. He knew where Daniels would be alone, in a house he had hoped would shield him from the wrath of a man whose child he had taken. But Marcus was done with hiding. He was done with waiting. The hunt was over. Marcus stood in the shadows of the darkened street, his eyes fixed on the house in front of him. The faint light from the single porch lamp cast long shadows over the yard, and Marcus could see the faint outline of the houses, windows, the dark shapes of curtains drawn tightly against the night. Inside, Daniels was likely cowering, too afraid to face the consequences of his actions. But Marcus wasn't afraid. The rage inside him burned hot, a fire that wouldn't go out until it had consumed everything in its path. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, even as his heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment he had been building toward, the moment when justice would be served in the only way he could see fit. He made his way to the front door, his steps deliberate, no more hiding, no more waiting. It was time to make Daniels understand exactly what it felt like to lose everything, to feel helpless, to feel that sharp, piercing pain that never really goes away. Inside, Officer Daniels was pacing back and forth. Fear was a cold sweat on his brow, his heart racing as he heard the slightest creak of the floorboards underfoot. His house was silent, save for the muffled sounds of his own movements. He was alone, no backup, no protection, just him, trapped in his own home, terrified of the man he had wronged. He had been expecting this, hadn't he? The retaliation, the revenge. He had killed a child, and Marcus was going to make him pay for it. The thought twisted in Daniel's gut, and a sick sense of dread coiled in his chest. He had been trying to justify his actions to himself, telling himself that he was just following orders, that it wasn't his fault. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had made the choice to pull that trigger. The door creaked open, and Daniels froze. Marcus stepped inside without a sound, his figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost. His eyes locked onto Daniels, who stood at the other side of the room, his hand instinctively going to the gun he kept in his holster. Daniels, the word was like a punch in the stomach, cold and sharp. Daniels's breath caught in his throat as his eyes met Marcus's. The officer's face went pale, his eyes wide with terror. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Daniels's voice broke through, trembling. "Please," he begged, his voice hoarse, the fear palpable. "Please, just listen. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Marcus interrupted, his voice low and filled with contempt. "You didn't mean to kill my son. You didn't mean to put a bullet in his chest. Is that what you're going to tell me?" Daniels took a step back, his knees trembling beneath him. I was just doing my job. I followed orders. Okay, it wasn't supposed to happen. Like that. I didn't know." Marcus's eyes flared with rage. You didn't know, you didn't know, you didn't think that maybe, just maybe, shooting a child in the chest would be a little bit too far. He stepped closer, his voice rising, shaking with the deep, raw pain of everything that had led him to this moment. I didn't have a choice, Daniels cried, his hands shaking, his gun still held tightly in his grasp. Though he made no move to raise it, I was just following orders, okay? They told me to clear the area. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was just a kid. Marcus's anger surged, and for a split second he considered ending it right there. The gun in his hand felt heavy, almost comforting. He could pull the trigger, and the pain would be gone. Daniel's life would be over, just like his son's had been. There would be no more suffering, no more vengeance, and, in that moment, it almost felt like the right thing to do. But then, a flash of Elijah's face passed before his eyes. The small boy, the joy in his eyes, the way he had run across the yard, full of life, full of potential, full of everything Marcus had lost, and it hit him like a wave, the memory of his son's laughter. The sound of his voice, the way Elijah's small hands had reached for him when he was scared. The weight of the choice crushed Marcus's chest. For a moment, he hesitated. He could let Daniels go, he could walk away, get out of this world of violence, and hold on to what little humanity was left in him. But could he really do that? Could he live with himself knowing that the man who had killed his son walked free? Daniels was still pleading, his voice a broken, desperate mess. Please, I was just doing my job. I didn't mean it. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. And in that moment, Marcus made his choice. The gunshot rang out, cutting off Daniels's words. The room went silent again, the finality of the shot hanging in the air like a bitter wind. Daniels collapsed to the ground, the expression of terror still frozen on his face, his body twitching slightly as the last breath left him. Marcus stood over him, the weight of the moment crushing down on him, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His fingers were still wrapped around the cold metal of the gun, but now it felt like nothing more than a weight in his hand. He had done it. He had crossed the line. The anger that had consumed him for weeks, the anger that had pushed him to this moment began to drain away, leaving nothing but an emptiness. The satisfaction of vengeance was fleeting, a hollow victory. He had avenged Elijah, yes, but at what cost? The man who had killed his son was dead, but Marcus was no longer the man he had been. He had crossed a line he could never return from. The man who had loved his son, the man who had dreamed of a different life, was gone. The world Marcus had once known was slipping away. The chaotic, violent actions of the past few days had rippled outward like a wave, affecting everyone and everything in its path. The news had spread quickly, a storm of headlines, flashing lights, and shaking cameras. The names of the dead officers, their families, and their tragic deaths were on every screen, on every station, across the city and beyond. Revenge in the streets. The bloodshed continues as former police officers' families become the latest victims in a growing feud. One news anchor read, her voice solemn as a stream of images flashed by pictures of the brutalized families, of the men and women who had once been protected by badges, now reduced to victims in a city that was losing control. The reactions from the people were a mixture of rage and confusion. There were protests in the streets, divided and heated. Some held signs that read "Justice for Tyrese," "Justice for the innocent," while others carried banners that shouted, "Vengeance is not justice." The streets were filled with anger, with people either supporting Marcus's actions, seeing them as a much-needed retaliation against a broken system, or condemning him as a vigilante, a man who had crossed a line no one should ever cross. The city was on edge, torn apart by the violence that had been ignited. The police were stretched thin, officers holding back from the streets, hesitant to make any moves that might escalate the situation further. Some called for a state of emergency. Others demanded the capture of Marcus, the man who had brought chaos to their doorstep. But Marcus didn't care about the streets. He didn't care about the protests, or the media, or the way the city was unraveling. As he sat in the dim light of his apartment, his eyes glued to the television, the weight of his actions crushed him. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like a hero. All he felt was empty. That it had been 2 weeks since Officer Daniels' death, since the final shot that had ended Marcus's hunt for revenge. He had spent those days watching the fallout unfold, seeing his name in the news, hearing the debates, but it all felt far away, like he was watching it all through a fog, as if he were already a stranger to it all. He was becoming a shadow of the man he had once been, the man who had a family, who had a future. Now, all he had were the consequences. Of his actions, the news was still dominated by the ongoing fallout from the murders of the police officers and their families. People who had once supported Marcus, who had seen him as a man who was finally standing up for the oppressed, were now questioning his actions. What had begun as a movement of sympathy for a father's loss was quickly morphing into something much darker. For Marcus, though, it didn't matter. Tanya was gone. She had left him in the middle of the night, taking only a few clothes, leaving behind a letter that was brief and final. I can't live with what you've become. This is not who we were. I'm taking Elijah's memory with me, but I can't take you with me anymore. I won't. That was all it said. There was no anger in the letter, no accusations, just a cold, painful truth. She had walked away, and in doing so, she had taken with her the last piece of the life Marcus had once had. He sat in the dark, staring at the paper in his hands, a coldness sweeping over him that matched the emptiness in his heart. She was right. He wasn't the man she had married anymore. He wasn't the father he used to be, the man who once thought he could build something better for his family. And now, there was nothing left. Marcus had tried to reach out to her, tried to explain, to make her see that he had done what he thought was necessary. He tried to justify it to himself, to her, but the more he spoke, the more he realized that he wasn't speaking to her anymore. He was speaking to the ghost of the man he had used to be. The house, once full of warmth and love, felt cold now. His son's laughter, the echoes of his tiny footsteps running through the hallways, had vanished. The silence was overwhelming, suffocating. Every corner of the apartment reminded him of what he had lost, and how far he had fallen. His family was gone. Marcus had spent his days walking through the streets, lost in thought, disconnected from everything. He hadn't made it to the protests. He hadn't spoken to anyone. There were whispers on the streets, faces turning away when he passed by. Some people still whispered his name with respect, even admiration. Others gave him looks filled with scorn and fear, but Marcus didn't care. He had learned that the world didn't owe him understanding. It didn't owe him anything. His thoughts were consumed with the weight of what he had done, with the feeling that he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. His thirst for revenge had cost him everything. The man who had held his son in his arms was gone, replaced by a man who didn't even recognize himself anymore. The fire of anger that had fueled him for so long was burning itself out, leaving only ashes behind. One evening, as Marcus walked down the street, his eyes focused on nothing, his thoughts swirling with confusion and regret, a voice broke through the fog. Marcus. He turned to see a man standing by the corner, an old face he hadn't seen in years. Rico, the man, had been part of the crew that had helped him execute his plan. He had been there at the beginning, back when Marcus had still been a man with something to lose. Rico, Marcus said, his voice hoarse, tired. What's up? I've been keeping tabs on things, Rico said, his voice low. They're still looking for you, man. They're gonna come for you soon. Marcus nodded absently, but there was no fear in his eyes. What was left for him to fear? The police, the media, the city, none of it mattered now. He had already lost, and what did it even mean to be found anymore? I don't need to be found, Marcus muttered. I've already lost everything. Rico watched him carefully. Don't talk like that, man. You got people out here who still respect what you did. You could run, Marcus. You don't have to be alone. But Marcus shook his head slowly. I don't need anyone, he said softly. I don't even know who I am anymore. There was a long silence between them, the city noises fading into the background. Rico said nothing, only nodded slowly, as if understanding the depth of Marcus's loss. Then, after a long moment, he spoke again. You're not the man you were, I know that. But you don't have to keep running from who you are now, either. You did what you had to do, but now, man, it's time to figure out what comes next. Marcus stared at the ground, lost in thought. What had come next? He had no answers. The anger that had driven him was gone, replaced by a deep, painful regret. There was no victory here, only the feeling of emptiness that had swallowed him whole. City was divided, the streets full of noise, of opinions, of people pointing fingers. But to Marcus, it was all just noise. The people, the protests, the division, it all felt distant, like he was watching it from another world, a world he could no longer touch. All he had left was the consequence of his actions, and the hollow space where his family had once been. The realization hit him hard, sharp and unyielding. His thirst for revenge had destroyed everything he loved, and the man he had become was no one he could ever face again. Marcus sat alone in the darkness of his apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling, but even that felt like an intrusion in the stillness. His eyes were fixed on the framed pictures of Elijah on the wall, Elijah laughing, playing, his smile, full of life. The boy who had once been his everything was now gone, erased by the very violence Marcus had set in motion. Was it worth it? Marcus thought, his mind replaying the days that had led him to this point. The vengeful path he had chosen had consumed him, had torn apart everything he loved. The city had burned, the streets divided, and in his wake, there was nothing but destruction. The officers, the families, they had all paid. But had that brought justice? Had it brought Elijah back? The answer was no. He had traded his son's life for a hollow victory, for a fleeting sense of justice that had slipped away the moment he had pulled the trigger. Marcus had thought revenge would be an answer away to reclaim what was lost, but all it had done was hollow him out even further. The emptiness inside him now was worse than it had ever been before. The rage that had driven him was gone, and all that remained was an overwhelming sense of loss. He had lost his family, his sense of self, his purpose, and now, he had no idea who he was anymore. He thought back to the day of the funeral, to Tanya's tear-streaked face, her final words echoing in his mind. She had been right. He wasn't the man she had married. He wasn't the man he had once been. The revenge that had seemed so justified in the beginning now seemed meaningless. A dark, twisted path that had led him here alone, broken, and unrecognizable. Marcus stood up, his hands shaking as he reached for the drawer in the kitchen. Inside, he found the bottle of pills that had been sitting there for days. He had never really thought about using them until now. But now, in the silence, the pain felt too much to bear, too much to face. There was no one left, no family, no purpose, only the weight of the choices he had made, the lives he had destroyed, and the man he had become. He looked once more at the pictures of Elijah, his heart breaking with the realization that nothing at all could bring his son back. With one last shaky breath, he opened the bottle and poured the pills into his palm. He had walked down this road for far too long. He had taken his revenge, and now the price had come due.